Now to begin our program, I would first like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support made this event possible. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today as your gift will be matched dollar for dollar with our matching gift program. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Our presenter today is Victoria Monagle, a Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Fellow. Victoria is a fifth-year PhD student at the University of New Mexico, and she specializes in zooarchaeology and researches prehistoric dogs in the Pueblo Southwest. Today, she will be sharing the results of her project identifying bones in the museum's collection. Please welcome Victoria.
Hi, good morning. Let's start. Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited to talk about this research that I've been working on the past year. As Shannon said, I'm a PhD student at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and I'll be discussing results from this zooarchaeological analysis of bones belonging to Georgia O'Keeffe. I usually study skeletons of prehistoric dogs in the Southwest, and I really love this subject because it makes for great conversations with the public, and I get to talk about archaeology and dead animals, very much like this project. So Georgia O'Keeffe not only sketched and painted animal bones while she lived in the Southwest, but she was often photographed with them at her home in Abiquiu. The Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe has many of these same bones in their museum collection, and many are available in the gallery for visitors to view. And I believe the museum will be opening again September 25th. So this project started because the museum wanted to increase knowledge about the collection of bones at the facility, and it's also a great opportunity for public outreach. The museum contacted the UNM Anthropology Department, and we collaborated to identify which animals these bones belong to. This project spanned 2 semesters, starting August 2019 and ending this May. And during this time, I analyzed 63 bones in the collection and took over 1,000 photos. Due to the importance and delicate nature of this collection, none of the bones ever left the research facility, and this is extremely rare in zooarchaeological studies. So zooarchaeologists study animal bones to understand how humans interacted with their environment in the past, and this includes other animals. We usually study a collection of bones from one site, and it makes it essential to know what animal species are likely to occur in that area or time period. When we're identifying a bone, we start with the broadest taxonomic group, and we try to narrow it down, usually to family, genus, and species. So in order to do this, we need to have access to a comparative bone collection, and this usually offers examples of different ages, sexes, and sizes of a species. So because I couldn't remove any of the bones from the museum, I had to rely heavily on photographs, reference guides, various tools to magnify and measure the bones, as well as opinions from other scientists and zooarchaeologists. When I thought I found a match to the bone but wasn't quite sure, I'd bring a comparative specimen from the comparative collections at UNM up to Santa Fe to see if it matched. And sometimes the animal species in the Georgia O'Keeffe collection weren't available at UNM. And so this is when I would contact other zooarchaeologists for help. So although Georgia O'Keeffe lived in Abiquiu for around 40 years and likely collected most of these bones herself, it's impossible to know exactly when or where they came from. So because of this, I didn't limit myself to references or species in the Southwest. although most of the animals turned out to be from this region anyway. One thing I did find interesting in this project is that even though Keefe likely saw many of these animals alive, it's the bones she chose to paint. So most of the animals in the collection were represented by only 1 or 2 bones. And so this was likely either due to preservation or just a collection preference by O'Keefe. And despite being stored outside for many years at Ghost Ranch, most of the bones are really well preserved. And although she collected many bones, not all of them were used in sketches or paintings. So she had skulls from more than 16 species, and she only painted the ones from the larger animals like the cows, the horses, deers, goats, pronghorn, and sheep. So my favorite animal from this collection was the pronghorn, and this is the single surviving species from the Antilocapridae family in North America. They shed their horns each year like deer and elk, and they keep the bony core underneath. So males have forward-facing prongs, while females usually lack prongs or have really tiny ones. And these horns rise from their skull right above their eyes. Georgia O'Keeffe had 2 skulls in this collection, a male and likely a female, as well as 2 horn sheds. So it's not surprising there are also multiple deer skulls and antlers in this collection. And there are 5 species in the West from the Cervidae family, and this includes moose and elk. And most of these are really distinguishable by their antlers and skulls. However, female mule deer and white-tailed deer are a little more difficult to distinguish between. So one of the deer skulls in this collection was a male, and it was easier to determine that it was a mule deer and not a white-tailed deer, because mule deer antlers have a central beam that forks into 2 branches, whereas white-tailed deer have single tines that grow from a central beam, kind of like elk. So here's one of the elk sheds in the collection. So like the white-tailed deer antlers, there's a single tine with branches coming off of it. So there was another deer skull in the collection. However, because it was from a female, I wasn't able to determine which deer species it belonged to, whitetail or mule deer. On the upper left, you can see one of the ways zooarchaeologists differentiate between these 2 species. So the arrows are pointing to what's called a lacrimal pit. And this is much longer in mule deer and shorter in white-tailed deer. And this area was a tiny bit damaged on the skull, so further analysis is needed to determine which species it belonged to. So I did expect there would be cattle bones in the collection. It's pretty common in New Mexico to come across them when walking in rural areas. And also Georgia O'Keeffe is in a few photos where she's holding cattle bones with skin on them still. And I was camping a few months ago and I found my own cow skull just camping. So it's pretty common. However, even though I did bring an entire set of postcranial bones, and that's all the bones under the skull, of cow and bison bones to the museum, because they're so similar, I still couldn't distinguish which species some of the bones belong to. So I'll need to bring more specimens to the museum to compare the bones to and determine exactly if they belong to cow or bison. So skulls are a different story. They're a bit more unique to the species. And I could say that the skull was from a cow and not a bison. Unfortunately for me, I was eager to see the skull that Georgia O'Keeffe had painted in cow's skull with calico roses and cow's skull red, white, and blue, but that wasn't one of the ones I had a chance to analyze this time. She did collect this Texas longhorn skull, which was pretty easy to identify, however, really difficult to photograph due to its size. It was huge. She had 2 sheep skulls in her collection. And this is just one skull, but from different angles. And at first I was really eager to say they were rams or bighorn sheep. However, there's actually another species of sheep called Dall sheep, and it's very similar to bighorn sheep. And this species mostly lives in the northwest part of the country. But because I can't limit these bones to the southwest, because I don't know where Georgia O'Keeffe collected them from or if they were given to her by somebody, until I can get comparative skulls to the museum in Santa Fe, I can just say that these are sheep. And so on the left, you'll see the Dall sheep, and on the right, you'll see the bighorn sheep that we have here in the Southwest. So you can see that unlike deer and elk, sheep have what are called true horns. So there's actually a pretty big bone underneath their horns, and they don't shed their horns every year. So even when they're alive, sheep and goats are commonly mixed up. But goats have horns that are usually thinner and straighter, and they kind of project away from their skulls, while sheep tend to have thicker and more round horns, and they tend to curl and go closer to their skulls. She also had horse bones in her collection, and there were 2 pelvic bones and also a spinal column with 2 additional vertebrae that fit with it. And at some point they must have fallen off. And this is one of those ones that connects. There was also a gray fox bone in the collection, and gray foxes are smaller than other foxes, and they're known for climbing trees, and they're super cute. But the bone from the fox was the left innominate, or the pelvic bone. And I had a difficult time identifying which species it belonged to because of how tiny it was. And since I study dog bones, I kept thinking it was a really tiny dog because of how round and circular the obturator foramen is, and that's this little hole right here. But luckily, we had a gray fox skeleton at UNM, and I was able to bring it up to Santa Fe and compare it, and it was really a perfect match. So that was really nice. There were 2 coyote bones, a skull and a mandible. And there was also this guy. And at first I had so much trouble figuring out what animal this was. I kept thinking it was a giant raccoon, maybe even a little tiny bear, but it's a wolverine. And I only got to that answer because I emailed it to other zooarchaeologists. And if you look at the lower jaw, you'll see that there's this very long molar right here. Now in most other animals like raccoons or bears, there's multiple molars and not a really long one right here. So that's a huge indicator this was a wolverine, but it was a huge one. It went past the ranges of what a wolverine should measure. And so this is what it looks like when it's alive. Still kind of scary, even with skin. There were 2 prairie dog skulls in the collection, as well as 2 pack rat skulls. There was an American mink, and so this belongs to the same family as a ferret or a weasel, and it's pretty widespread through North America, where it's a native species, and some parts of Europe where it's actually considered to be an invasive species. She had 2 porcupine mandibles. There was also a porcupine skull, but I didn't analyze it. It had plenty of skin and quills on it, and the curators preferred that it stayed in the bag. I did want to look at it though. So this mandible is from an American beaver, and it's probably my favorite bone in the collection because of how beautiful it is. But you can see that beaver mandibles have a very distinctive bone extension right here. This is a groundhog skull, and they have very pointed post-orbital processes right here and really developed or large occipital crest right here. But I still had trouble figuring out which animal it was and still needed some assistance from other zooarchaeologists. So this is a great horned owl beak, and great horned owls have beaks that are short, deep, and hooked. And they usually have a partial beak sheath, and that's like a small keratin cover that's on the tip of the beak. And this one seems to have lost it, as well as the rest of its skull. There were 2 eagle skulls in the collection. The top one was in excellent condition, very well preserved, definitely a bald eagle. The bottom one was less well preserved and is also missing a beak sheath, but I'm thinking it's also a bald eagle. I'll need to get some comparative specimens up to the museum to make sure. The collection also contained the top portion from the skull of a long-nosed garfish. And so this was a native species to New Mexico that's no longer present. I really had no idea what animal this bone belonged to because it didn't match any fish or reptile references I had access to. However, I sent it around to some other UNM zooarchaeologists, and Asia Alsgaard recommended comparing it to a garfish, and it was really a perfect match. It's really interesting, and I'm really curious about how Georgia O'Keeffe came across it. It'd be really neat if she found it. There was a very large whale bone in the collection. And so this was likely when Georgia O'Keeffe went to Hawaii in 1939. And I sent photos to another zooarchaeologist named Sally Evans, and she specializes in bones from the North Atlantic region. And so she was able to narrow it down to a lumbar vertebra from an adult whale in the Globicephalinae family. And so possibly a pilot whale or a pygmy killer whale. And that's what that picture is on the right. One of the neat things I found during this analysis, there was an abandoned wasp nest in the brain case of this mule deer. And so that was really neat. And it's probably just from being stored outside where Georgia O'Keeffe would keep a lot of the bones. So while I'm waiting for the museum to open and comparative collections to be available again, I've started looking at how O'Keeffe included some of the bones in her paintings. And I've been trying to match up some of these bones in her paintings to some of the bones in the collection. So this mule deer skull I looked at is missing its premaxillary bones right here. But I still think it's a pretty strong match for the mule deer skull in Summer Days, even though the skull in Summer Days has a complete skull. And so I believe this same skull was also used for this painting, deer's skull with pedernal. However, the skull in the painting seems to show a very large supraoccipital foramina right here, and not on the other side. And if you look at the skull that I studied and photographed, it doesn't show that same pattern. So I wonder if this was an artistic addition by Georgia O'Keeffe, or if there's another mule deer skull maybe at Ghost Ranch still. So the pronghorn skull that I analyzed with the attached horns, it doesn't seem to be the same one in her paintings. So the horn on the pronghorn in the paintings, it doesn't extend completely to cover the bony core as it does on the specimen I looked at. So I'm guessing there's probably another pronghorn skull or a couple at Ghost Ranch. I believe that the Spanish goat skull in the collection was used in these 2 paintings, ram's skull with brown leaves and ram's head, white hollyhock hills. Even though the skull in the paintings is complete, And the one I analyzed is missing the lower portion of the skull, or this rostrum right here. However, there seems to be some really unique damage where the horn attaches to the skull, and that is depicted in these paintings. So likely when she painted the skull, I'm guessing it was complete and it's just fallen apart over the years. She painted another, it seems Spanish goat, but I don't think it's the same one I analyzed. In Ram's Head Blue Morning Glory, there's some damage to the top of the brain case, and that's not apparent on the skull I analyzed. So again, it's either an artistic interpretation by Georgia O'Keeffe, or perhaps there's another skull at Ghost Ranch. I didn't see red and pink rocks with teeth when I took photos of this bone. It's a partial mandible from a sheep or a goat, but I just got really lucky in that the angle I photographed it from matched this painting. So I think it's the same one. It's pretty similar in the damage and details and how many teeth there are. So I believe Red Hills and Bones shows a femur that wasn't in the collection I analyzed, but it also has a spinal column with 10 vertebrae, and there was one in the collection that matched, that belonged to a horse. And at first I thought it wasn't the same one, just because the one in the collection had 8, but like with the rest of the bones, I think over time it just fell apart, and there did happen to be 2 vertebrae in the collection that connected to it perfectly, so that ended up being a great match. So this is a horse lumbar vertebra that I think was painted in Flying Backbone #2. However, I hadn't seen this painting at the time, and when I took photos, I didn't take photos underneath this bone, but I think if I did, it would be a really great match just visually. One of the days I was at the museum, I was lucky enough to catch Dale Cronkite, who's the head of conservation there, studying O'Keeffe's spring painting. So Dale right here and Judy Smith right here, who's the collections manager and worked with me on this project, they're holding up a cattle bison lumbar vertebra and a mule deer antler with part of the brain case attached, maybe to match the composition of how Georgia O'Keeffe might have painted them. So they seem to be a pretty good match. That was a really fun thing to do, actually. So it's kind of difficult to make out the brain case over here attached to the horn on the left and horn and feathers, but I think it's depicting this incomplete sheep skull and horn in the photo. There's a few paintings that are a little more abstract, but someone could definitely see how they might be representing a sheep skull or a bighorn skull. Same with this one. Again, it's more difficult when the paintings are more abstract. However, we can see just in general, these 2 images are extremely similar in shape and composition. So I have this quote from Georgia O'Keeffe. "For years in the country, the pelvis bones lay about the house, indoors and out, seen and not seen as such things can be seen in many different ways. I don't remember picking up the first one, but I remember when I first noticed them, always knowing I would one day be painting them." And so I believe Georgia O'Keeffe used the obturator foramen, this large hole here in the pelvic bones, to frame some of the landscape she painted. And most of the pelvic bones were from larger animals like cows and horses, but the more round shape resembled the foramen from the gray fox bone the most, I think. So you can see that the obturator foramen is more oblong and oval in this pelvic bone than the circular shape of the gray fox innominate in the previous slide. Oops. So here's another sketch, and you can see there's not as many details to match it perfectly to the skull on the left, but you can see it's from a Texas longhorn. So pelvis with shadows and the moon, it connects multiple bones. However, this doesn't exist in nature. So I think she combined bones. I can see maybe 2 pelvic bones in here and a sacrum, and these are the ones we have in the collection. I think they're a good match. Same with these 2 paintings. She combined multiple bones to create something new. So on the left, she might have been painting elements or some landmarks from a femur. And on the right, and from the far away nearby, she combined and added multiple antlers from mule deer. And I really like that, even though she had elk bones in the collection, who knows if she had them at the time, but she chose to use mule deer antlers the entire time to attach to this animal she created. So after studying and documenting this collection, I felt inspired and started researching more about Georgia O'Keeffe. It's always really nice to find someone who has the same interests as you, especially when those interests are dead animals or bones, and especially when that person is really amazing and famous. It kind of makes it okay to like animal bones and collect them. So one thing I really want to do is study the bones at Ghost Ranch. This collection was from the museum in Santa Fe. And so there's an entire other collection at Ghost Ranch, including some of the larger animal skulls she used in her paintings, as well as this snake skeleton. I think that's embedded in a bench there. There's a replica of it at the museum as well. So another idea, and I've spoke with this, about this idea to the curators as well, is to 3D scan some of the bones, especially the smaller ones, like this innominate from the gray fox, because it would be really neat for visitors to have a 3D scan, a printed 3D scan of this bone, and to be able to hold it and study it and paint it, kind of like Georgia O'Keeffe did. So I want to say thank you to everyone at the museum. Everyone was extremely excited about this project, and that's really nice, especially Judy and Sherry, who were extremely supportive and helpful. I want to thank all the zooarchaeologists that helped me out. I sent a lot of photos to Terry Martin, and he helped me tremendously with some of the trickier bones, like the rodent bones, where they look pretty similar to each other. And especially Sally Evans, she helped so much with the whale vertebra. And also everyone in the department was extremely helpful anytime I had a question about a species I wasn't familiar with. So I do want to mention that all of the bone photos I took are available on the website for everyone to look at, just as well as all the other collection materials at the museum. So anyone can go online and look up photos of Georgia O'Keeffe, her book collections, her furniture, her clothing, and her paintings, of course. And all of the photos I used of Georgia O'Keeffe and her paintings, I used from the museum website. So that is it.
Thank you, Victoria. So before we stop sharing your screen and get to some other questions, there's a question in here that I think you probably have like a slide in here that'll help with this question. So from Tom, the goat head paintings with rounded bones seem more like sheep horns.
The
He's
goat
asking, is he missing something?
paintings with rounded bones.
Yeah, the goat head paintings with rounded bones seem more like sheep horns.
Let's see. Goat head paintings, rounded bones. Assuming he's talking about the Spanish goat. This guy. Right? So there's the sheep and then there's the goat. And so you could see the goat's horns have a different formation than the sheep.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to see the comparison so that we can tell the difference between the sheep
so
and the goat.
the
Because you
sheep-
even mentioned as you were going through these that people often confuse the two.
Yeah, even when they're alive. When I was a park ranger, it was a big joke, and we'd always refer visitors to videos. There's a YouTube video, a really silly one actually, on sheeps versus goats when they're alive. And so when they're dead, it's even more difficult, especially if you don't have the skull. And so the skull, nice way to say very confidently if one species, if it belongs to one species or the other.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and Tom did comment. He said the painting is labeled goat by George O'Keeffe.
Yeah, so, and that was kind of a thing we came across when I was doing this analysis. And because George O'Keeffe is so amazing and famous, I didn't want to say, like, hey, she mixed them up too, but I think she did. And that's just a super common thing. So that's actually, and all the paintings I think are the Spanish goat. They were labeled ram. And in all of the paintings she labeled sheep, they're actually a goat. So pretty common thing to do.
Excellent. And we have a question. Were you able to get the number of cow or cattle bones in the collection, or what were the number of those that you ended up looking at?
Let's see. There were 2 skulls and 2 pelvic bones, a spinal column, and I think that was it in the collection I looked at. I know for sure there are more because there are pictures from Ghost Ranch with lots of cow bones that I didn't study, as well as some in paintings and even pictures with George O'Keeffe holding them that weren't in the collection. So I can for sure get, and I think, so there's an article going to be published with the George O'Keeffe magazine, and I put specific numbers, I think, for the species in there.
Excellent. And then there's a second part to that question from Anna. I heard that the Depression and Dust Bowl period affected the number of cattle bones in the landscape. Do you have anything you could tell us about that?
Affected them, I'm guessing maybe more animals died during that period, and so there's going to be more bones in the environment, and maybe if they're covered with sediment, they might be more well preserved. So I would think maybe that period of time could have increased the number of bones. I haven't looked that up specifically, but that's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. We had a question early on about, do you plan on doing any DNA test on the skulls that need further analysis?
I think with other,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, with other sites like archaeological sites where maybe archaeologists are interested in understanding the difference between a species and it's not apparent from the bones, like maybe postcranial bones or bones from like dogs or coyotes, you'd want to do a DNA test to figure it out. But for the museum, I think their main goal was a simple species identification. And also, DNA testing is pretty destructive. And so I think the point of the museum is preservation and trying to keep the bones in the most similar state they were in when they were owned by Georgia O'Keeffe.
And we had many complimentary comments about your photography. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about the process of how you get such a wonderful, you're getting these beautiful photographs of the bones.
Thank you. So I used some studio lights that were in the museum facility. I used my own camera, and it really wasn't like a very romantic looking process. A lot of it was me hunched over in weird positions, getting all these photos. You know, it's really warm and I was really sweaty, and I didn't think these photos would come out as great as they did. But, you know, after I uploaded them on my computer, I went into Photoshop, and one thing that I did is I outlined the bone and erased the background and filled it with a black backdrop. And so that really helped the details of the bone come out without focusing on all the little bone parts. Because when you're taking pictures of bones, you're handling them. Lots of dirt and like little tiny bone chunks are going everywhere. They're falling off, and that shows up in the pictures. And so in Photoshop, I was able to remove a lot of that. I think I have a picture. So in this picture at the bottom right, you can see this is just like bone dust and chunks. And that was super stressful when those things would fall off the bones, but it's really common. And no big chunks fell off. No bones were harmed in this project.
Excellent. Did you come across any bones in the collection that are prehistoric?
I think that refers to maybe much earlier animals, but all the animals in the collection were, you know, from the last, like they've been present in the environment the last like 100 years. So they're all pretty modern animals.
I'm just scanning for other questions. Did you find any human bones in the collection, or do we know if O'Keeffe ever discovered any?
I don't know if she ever discovered any. And luckily I didn't discover any. I never really want to discover any.
And do we have any other questions? We have time for a few more if anyone has any questions. But Victoria, I would like for you to talk about, because we talked about this a little bit last week, how the pandemic has like shifted your work. Because you talked about how you usually compare bones in person, and then you also discussed DNA analysis. So how are you working now?
So usually if you're doing an analysis on bones, you want to get that collection and take it to a comparative collection. And when I first learned I couldn't do that, I was kind of nervous because I think it just didn't seem legitimate to me to take a lot of photos and try and identify bones and then bring these like giant boxes of bones from Albuquerque to Santa Fe each time I had a question. But actually, I've heard from other zooarchaeologists during this time that that's how they're working now anyway, because a lot of comparative collections are not accessible or museums are closed. People are having to rely on photographs that are sent to them, reference guides. And so it seems like I just was ahead of the curve by a few months doing this. And then it does make this make me feel more confident about that this could be a new way to do a zooarchaeological analysis, especially if you can bring comparative collections later on up to compare. And also just being on the safe side with identifications, not calling it a certain species if there's any uncertainty or if you don't have that comparative collection on hand. But really, probably the neatest thing was the network of people willing to help, the zooarchaeologists that would respond to emails and say, oh, I don't know what that looks like, but why don't you check this reference out? Or that looks like this animal from this region, or can you send me more photos of this side? It was just really neat to see that this is a science that's compatible with, with in quarantine and the pandemic, when a lot of, I think, science isn't. So that was really neat. I really like that experience. I thought that was cool, that I was able to experience it. And then when everything shut down, I was already, on this process. I was already doing this. So it wasn't a big change for me.
That's great. And we have a question from Kayleen. Would 3D scanning the bones also help with your analysis and identification?
Yeah, for sure. And that's something I've been doing on other collections I've studied, especially if there's going to be any destructive analysis after. 3D scanning is amazing for preservation of a bone, for the data, and for other archaeologists to see it when they're states away or in a different country. It takes a lot of time though. So the amount of time it took to analyze and photograph these bones was like a year's worth, and probably would take months to 3D scan all of these. But I think it's something a lot of museums are doing now, just for preservation or data sharing. And then just giving you a look on all sides of the bones. It's really difficult to take a photo and know that the proportions are exact because it's a warped view. It's not reality sometimes. And so a 3D scan is a really good alternative to that. It just takes a lot of time.
Yeah, we did have a small pelvis bone on display that people, like a 3D printed one, but unfortunately, at this time, we won't be able to have that on display because we can't have anything that people can handle. But I know I took that into classrooms, and it was always really fun. The kids enjoyed handling it, and I didn't have to worry about them breaking it or damaging it at all. So,
that's amazing. And then you don't have to worry about anyone touching the bone and then touching their mouth, and it's like it's plastic.
Yeah. All right. Well, it looks like those are all the questions we have. So do you have any, what project are you working on now, Victoria?
Right now I am working on my dissertation proposal. So back to prehistoric dogs in the Southwest. But hopefully in the future, I can continue to study some of the other bones at Ghost Ranch, or even do more research on Georgia O'Keeffe's process, her experience with the bones.
Excellent. Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you all at our next program.